Hey gamers, Maniac here with GameAccess.net, coming to you from the future, or should I say the present. The present is the future, basically, because a lot of famous movies over the course of time have made grand predictions, and this has been going back as far as movies have been a thing. This video is kind of a tribute to those in a lot of ways. I'm going to rail off stream of consciousness. What did we get? What didn't we get? What did we get that you didn't think we were going to get? And what movies actually had predictions that you probably never heard of that they actually got really right? And of course, given the hat, I got to start with Back to the Future, basically. I know a lot of people are basically saying Back to the Future 2, Part 2 got it completely wrong. Where's our flying cars? Our flying cars should have arrived 7 years ago. Yeah, they didn't get that one. They admit they weren't going to get that one. They just wanted to make the future look the future, basically. So, for the most part, if you were calling for me to say the flying cars did not come, no, the flying cars did not come. And no, I am not going to put exceptions for this because I know that a lot of people have theorized that there are prototype flying cars out there. They are airplanes, basically, that can somehow drive in certain modes on the ground. That is not flying cars that we saw in movies like Blade Runner or Back to the Future Part 2. With those movies specifically, they did not, those cars were basically quote unquote hover converted or had been built with hover abilities in them. We don't have that. Best I can tell, that technology that they were showing in those films was essentially anti-gravity technology, not flight as we know it today. We haven't figured out anti-gravity. If we could figure out anti-gravity, we'd get somewhere, but we haven't. Hoverboards, technically we got those, technically we didn't get those. However, we kind of did, but we kind of didn't. We didn't get hoverboards the way that everybody kind of predicted that we did. I know that there are a lot of systems out there, like the Segway, for example. Those are not hover. They use gyroscopes and wheels. They are essentially powered, wheeled, electric motored units. There is a wheelless mechanism, basically, like a wheelless hover board that was invented that uses superconductors. However, it requires metallic surfaces to operate on, so it has to have a designated area, and it requires constant liquid nitrogen because I don't think we've been able to figure out how to get superconductors to work at room temperature. If we can figure that out, maybe we can have our hoverboards. I've been told that is still being developed, but for right now, it's just superconductors, and they only work at the minus temperatures, very low minus temperatures. So those are the 2 or 3 things that everybody's going to say, we didn't get those, it's not the future. Fine. Moving on. Well, what did we get from Back to the Future Part 2? What have we gotten? Well, blink and you'll miss it. There is a lot of things actually that we did see in Back to the Future Part 2 that we actually did get, or close enough derivatives are that I'll let it slide. If you neglect the cars and the hoverboards, basically, a lot of the Back to the Future Part 2 actually did come to pass. And I'll go on about actually what we did end up getting. Most people would probably remember that famous scene in the towards the end of the 2015 sequence where an aged Michael J. Fox is supposed to be like an older Marty McFly, decides he wants to take a phone call with his coworker played by Flea from, in Needles. His coworker Needles is played by Flea. And he actually has a video conference essentially, on his big screen television. The fact he had a big screen flat panel television was like, we got that. I mean, we got that a long time ago. Large flat panels, that we got those ever since pretty much the mid 2000s. TVs that were certainly big enough to fit that show, even for the middle class, but certainly for the wealthy, have been around for a very long time. The TVs being voice commanded, well, we've had that since at least 2012, at least, probably a little bit earlier than that. There are voice remotes that are available, but I distinctly remember when the Xbox One was first released, one of its options was that you could use the Xbox Kinect actually to use voice commands without having to use a remote, and it would change the station on your DVR or on your cable box. Multi-channel things, the ability to watch multiple channels all at once. I know that there are several cable providers that will offer that option. And you can literally say, even to your remote to this day, I want to watch the Weather Channel, and it will tune directly to that channel, as opposed to listing out the channel numbers. And those, we got that. That was just amazing. But there were a couple of other components about that were lost. Fax machines are still around. We're still using them. They can be printed out on multiple systems. We have plain paper faxes. Don't know if that was something that was available in the 80s, but plain paper faxes are still in function and are still being used to this day through phone lines. The ability to use bank transactions, or most transactions being done through the banks. If you look really closely, there are ATMs in that universe. They did establish that most credit transactions are done with through bank transactions. So most people, instead of paying cash, although cash was available, we'll get into that in just a further second. But even though cash was available, most people, especially young people, would be doing all their transactions through debit or credit to their accounts. The indicator being the thumbprints. Essentially, you would use your thumbprint to access your credit, or do it for other things like unlock the front door of your house. Well, we do have thumbprint openers for houses. They run on batteries. So again, they are in use, though they're not very heavily used, because if your power goes out and you don't have a key, how are you going to open your door? We haven't done away with doorknobs, though. They got that part wrong. But for the idea of using things like your thumbprint, and most people using debit for transactions, they got that part right. It's just not, they wouldn't do everything through the thumbprint, because of course not everybody wants to use their thumb for all their transactions. Most people nowadays would use Apple Watches or their cell phones basically to do these transactions. We didn't really see cell phones in the future. They didn't predict that part. However, there was something that they did predict that they also got right, that kind of played into that, and I'll go into that. I'll go into that in just a second once we're past the credit transactions. Now, obviously, there was following up with money. They also got one major component right also, and that was hyperinflation. Doc says in the beginning of the movie, here, go out and buy a Pepsi. Here's a 50. They predicted that a Pepsi would be, you would have to pay at least like $50 cash basically to get change for a Pepsi basically. So that hasn't gotten as bad as they expected it to, but they did expect inflation, and they got the inflation has been happening for at least the last 20 or so years. It's seriously picked up, and it has continued to pick up. The other thing is about the last thing I wanted to make note about for currency was, of course, you notice in the very beginning of the movie, Doc also mentions that all the kids have their pants pockets inside out, like this, basically. Well, they predicted in this future, essentially, that if everybody was doing their transactions or could be identified from their thumbprints, well, what was the point of having a wallet? What was the point of carrying around a purse? What was the point of your pockets essentially had no purpose anymore? And so the fashion trend basically about the kids walking around with their pant pockets pulled out because they don't need wallets or anything. I think I'd like to think that may not actually happen, although most people will use Apple Watches, and these Apple Watches can work independently. Even though there were no cell phones in the future that we saw, they kind of missed the boat on that one. There is one thing they actually did show, and that actually also came true.
I'm sorry.
VR headsets. During dinner time, actually, you would see Marty McFly Jr. and Marty McFly's daughter, I forget her name, I think it was Martine. But basically, the young Michael J. Fox's son and daughter, essentially also played by Michael J. Fox, in a great CG effect that still holds up to this day, where basically they're wearing VR headsets to dinner. And if you actually watch what they're doing, now obviously Martine I think has her visor off for most of it, but Marty Jr. does have his visor on through most of the dinner. He's still able to interact with. It's implied that he's either playing a video game or he's watching something. So he's kind of lost in his game essentially while he's having dinner, but he's still able to have some functionality with this. And of course, like I said, VR headsets do exist which offer that ability. But the thing that I got a kick out of is when Needles or Flea calls the house, their headsets picked up call waiting, implying that their headsets were connected to the phone lines because they could both determine that if somebody had called and who had called, and just to notify somebody in case the call was them. Maybe they could have picked up their call from their headsets. I don't know it, but obviously the call wasn't for them, so they didn't want it. They didn't want to talk to Needles, obviously. No, I don't blame them, of course. But yeah, obviously they wanted their father to take the call, and he's like, "Oh, I'll just take it in the den," and it's a video conference essentially. They got that right. However, there is one part of that we haven't gotten yet, as far as I'm aware. If I'm in VR and I get a phone call, the VR system will not. They haven't quite figured out how to tie that in yet. Maybe that's coming. Maybe that's a bit ahead of us. But one thing that I did notice is that is a problem, and that's an ongoing problem, is if I am in VR, whether it's an independent VR system like the MetaQuest that I'm using, or previously a wired system like the PlayStation VR, for example, if I'm getting a phone call, I don't know about it. The system can't determine that because that's not tied into the phone systems. That is going to be an Achilles heel. I have seen Meta talk about the possibility that they could allow for phone notifications through Meta, but you have to tie your phone or your device into the Meta system and through the Meta app. However, I haven't tested that, and I'm kind of afraid to, basically. That's like one thing I'm kind of like, I kind of want to keep my contacts and information separate from my Meta profile. So that's neither here nor there. I don't know how I feel about that one. Other stuff that they showed, there were no robots in 2015's Back to the Future. We didn't get robots in the 2019 Blade Runner either, at least not robots like we saw capable. There aren't off-world colonies. None of that came to pass, at least. However, we have been slower in space exploration and space development over the past, I guess you would say, 40 or 50 years. We've very much slowed down. Most of the of space travel is relegated to the Earth's atmosphere, or the lower Earth's atmosphere, the upper Earth's atmosphere. We haven't really done too much when it comes to interplanetary colonization or even lunar colonization, although we have sent probes and stuff like that over there and rockets over there for testing landers over there. It has become a bit more monumental task, and basically they want to make sure that they have it right the first time, essentially, because they know how much it's going to cost to make this happen. So movies like 2001, unfortunately, that predicted interplanetary futures, Blade Runner, which predicted off-world colonies and things like that, that really hasn't came to pass. However, Blade Runner did predict some things successfully, particularly the impact of global warming on the population of the animal life on the planet. Obviously, things are still happening. It just hasn't progressed as quickly as, thankfully, hasn't progressed as badly or as quickly as Blade Runner's predicted. But back to a more lighter note, things we did get from Blade Runner, video phones, although they're better than that part we got much better. That we got the ability to zoom in on pictures. We got that one, although most people were thinking, yeah, no, that's just a fantasy because he was taking images and blowing them up. All he'd see is blur, basically, unless he's got some really high-powered lenses or some really detailed negatives. I don't think that's even remotely possible in the way the film shows that you'd be able to scan an image and then get it blown up to the pixel and it would be able to render itself. I don't think we're there yet. Or I don't even know if that is possible, even with the AIs. If the image is just that low resolution, I don't think even AI would be able to upsample as good as we saw in Blade Runner. Other stuff, Star Trek. We're not there yet. That was I think the earliest Star Trek stuff they were talking about was 2063, the warp drive, the faster than light travel. That we haven't gotten to yet. However, there is one thing we did get: tablets. I know it's probably saying, "Wow, Star Trek predicted tablets." Yep. We actually see tablets quite frequently in the next Star Trek: The Next Generation, and that was passed down. Usually, you very rarely see people write things down in pens and paper, actually, in Star Trek, unless there's some special event or something. But most people, when they're looking up information, obviously they can go to a computer terminal or something along those lines. But if people are just simply taking notes, you would typically see them basically write their notes down on what's essentially a flat smartphone or something along this size, actually. In fact, I would probably argue that Star Trek was probably one of the inspirations for the tablet computer, essentially. In fact, actually, in Star Trek, their tablets were actually referred to as pads, PADD. Not iPads, obviously. That's Steve Jobs for you. But the pads did come true, and we do have them to this day. And Star Trek predicted it. Obviously, even before then, Star Trek got smartphones. Although I don't count I don't know if I count the smartphone as a tricorder or something. The guy who invented the original smartphone did say he got the idea to do it based upon seeing the communicators in Star Trek. So we did get communicators, but its ability to beam us interplanetarily has not been figured out yet, nor have we got faster than light travel. Although, honestly, I have theorized, and I probably would theorize, and you're free to disagree with me because it's just a theory, that if we could figure out a way to generate enough power, whether it be through an antimatter reactor or something else, basically, to travel faster than light, you probably would have enough power for human teleportation. I'm just saying, I think that amount of power would probably be enough for human teleportation as well as faster than light travel. But you would need to have the essentially a warp core invented first, which we haven't figured out yet.
I didn't get that.
Yep.
Could you try again?
And that's another thing that we actually got that nobody has mentioned. Voice assistants. I mentioned before, there have been movies that predicted the present that got it wrong. There have been movies you've never heard of that actually got it completely right. One of the favorite underrated movies, and if you actually look back as far as you can on my YouTube channel, you'll see a review I did with Disc Reader 117, a movie we reviewed called Brainscan starring Edward Furlong. And there is one thing that they actually showed. There were a couple of things that they showed in that movie that were basically fantasy. Essentially, the movie, for if you haven't seen my review of it or you haven't seen the film itself, because it is kind of hard to come by, and I don't believe it's on streaming services right now. The movie Brainscan basically is about Edward Furlong, who is a high school aged child that basically is obsessed with horror movies and horror video games for PC CD-ROM. And he orders a PC CD-ROM game after finding out about it in an issue of Fangoria. And well, after ordering the game, it's a CD-ROM game, but basically dials out through the phone line, so that's how he plays it. Essentially a form of DRM, although I have my theories as to maybe not DRM. Maybe it was using it for DLC or for extra code or something like that. I don't know. But he did have to dial out in order to use it might be MMO or something, in order to use the game. He did actually have something. He actually had a voice assistant, a computerized voice assistant that he called Igor. And I remember thinking to myself, out of all of the stuff that he had, including the game that made him hallucinate that he had hurt people, that the thing that actually would come true about that would be the voice assistant. As you've heard from my watch, we got those. They predicted that for the present, but I think that movie was supposed to take place at least a little bit in the future. But yeah, Brainscan, we don't have hypnosis, and I don't think we're going to, because that movie kind of required that they would use a CRT for the game to work, and we don't really use CRTs anymore because it would use CRTs through the television's blinking signal to make you play the game. Nowadays, we're all using flat panels, and so that didn't happen. But that was just one thing that Brainscan got right that I really did appreciate. And of course, most people would probably credit that to the computer voice from Star Trek also, whereas all queries would go through voice on Star Trek. There is one last thing that I want to say that I don't think anybody's really familiar with. And that was, I was watching an old House of the Future newsreel from 50 years ago, 70 years ago or something, where they were like futurists on film using some kind of grant or something like that, tried to predict the house of the future. What did we get from that? What didn't we get from that? Well, they envisioned that pretty much all cooking would go through microwaves. We didn't get that. People are still using ovens and grills and stovetops and stuff like that, although people are using microwaves. Another thing they predicted was in the future, all environments will be dust free because you'd have HVAC systems basically running through the house 24/7, basically clearing the dust and running the dust through screens. I mean, by screens, I mean filters, basically air filters, air purification filters. So they predicted air purification filters. Don't know how that worked out for them. I know that there are HVAC systems out there. For the life of me, even in houses when it's made well, I don't know how, I still have to dust. So I don't know how well that turned out. There's still very fine dust, or there's still dust that's not going to be picked up by an HVAC system. But I'll give them that one. I can't really give them that one. Another thing is they predicted that people's closets would have their own steam cleaners. Don't think that happened either. However, personal steam cleaner devices are available and have been available for a very long time. Probably even back then, steam cleaning devices were available. They basically predicted that you would be wearing a suit to work. You'd come home with your suit. You'd take your suit off, obviously. You'd hang it up in your closet, and your closet would basically have its own dry cleaner, basically. The steam cleaner, heat cleaner. That would be your closet. We didn't get that as far as I know. It's not the greatest idea either when it comes to practicality, especially since people do put more stuff in their closet than just clothes. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't want to put a collectible in something that would cause high temperature heat. That would pretty much ruin it. But again, personal steam cleaners, we did get those. So they were about, I'll give them 50-50. I'll meet them halfway on that one. The two things I actually thought were the funniest ones was one that they got completely right and another one they got halfway, but in a very funny way. They predicted that nutrition would, of course, be an issue in the future, essentially, and that you would actually be able to interface with your house's internal computer, essentially, to plan out your meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, essentially. Obviously, in the future, this was the 1950s, so it would be the mother's, job to do this, where she would interface with the terminal. She would take everybody's order through the intercom systems. We got those. We definitely got those. We've had those for a very long time. In fact, I remember my house which was built in the 90s. My father put a wired intercom system. Never worked. Too much interference. But nowadays, everybody just uses their voice systems for intercoms, and it works just fine. Also for making announcements, so we got that. But basically, she would take everybody's order. She would put those orders into the computer. The computer would then have an inventory in place of all the food that was in the pantry, and make recommendations for meals for everybody. It would also take into account everybody's weight and height, and the calories of all the food that they requested for what would be a daily allotment of meal. That was an interesting concept, I thought. And it is being actively done to this day, essentially, because a lot of people are counting carbs for all the stuff that they've been eating. Of course, this is not forced upon us. People are choosing to do this, but they did predict that this would be a feature that would be available. So if somebody said, I want a cheeseburger for lunch, it would say, no, there's too many carbs in that. You're overloaded on carbs. Why not go bunless and have a steak instead or something? So it would make recommendations based upon what you've currently got in your system. Now, how it would be monitoring that stuff, I don't know. I don't remember if the movie actually showed that. But obviously, systems like this can track that kind of thing based upon your a couple of things. And who knows if the system is allowing for blood tests and stuff like that too. So, or it's just computing based upon what was already put into the system, which is probably the easiest way that it would do that. I thought that was kind of interesting. I completely think it just totally ruined its idea of health and nutrition, because essentially all food was microwaved and prepared almost immediately. But that was actually, I thought, kind of interesting. The other thing that they predicted, the last thing I wanted to bring up for this, was the ability for online shopping. this House of the Future video that I watched actually did predict online shopping would be a thing. Essentially, that the wife would be able to do, or that anybody essentially would be able to download and view catalogs on essentially reflective flat panel screens. So that they would always be able to have access to the latest goods from whatever store they wish to patron. They'd have the entire catalog available to them based on their screen just by pushing a button, essentially. Of course, that's Amazon right there, isn't it? But there was one thing they actually got wrong. They predicted in a way it was like how you would have the JCPenney catalogs essentially loaded onto your computer with the push of a button. The one thing that they didn't think in mind was, and this is where we surpassed that, was that they had predicted that we would be able to, or that they figured that in order to make a purchase through that catalog, that you would still have to use your landline telephone to place the order, kind of like QVC or Home Shopping Network. So I'll give them, they predicted QVC or Home Shopping Network. But essentially, they had pretty much half figured out Amazon, because they didn't figure out, or they didn't think about, if you can create a computer terminal or a computer of any type that's able to show you a catalog or able to download a recent catalog of goods, then there's really not much that can prevents you from essentially using that terminal to place the order, or place an order for whatever it is that you want without having to use a telephone. Pretty tricky, I thought. But that was, and of course, there's some other stuff, of course, that I completely forgot about, like Back to the Future having not just the big screen flat panel televisions, but also their choice of programming on a couple of other things. Like at one point, they had a projector screen that they were using to watch television in a separate room. We got those. We definitely got personal projectors these days that can show all kinds of content. The Scenery Channel. Hello, have you watched Pluto TV or the Samsung TV Plus application on your television? Scenery channels are absolutely a thing, and if you don't have that, YouTube's got scenery channels that people can watch on any screen that they want that has access to the application. So that's another point for Back to the Future Part 2. Where do I think we're due for? I don't think we're going to figure out the flying cars. I think it's a stopper right there. Again, in order to have flying cars, we would need to be able to figure out a way to negate gravity. I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime. I also don't think that we're going to have interplanetary colonization as quickly as we think it is. It's probably not going to be our generation. It's not going to be the next generation. We could be on the cusp of a breakthrough in power if somebody can figure out an antimatter reactor. But I don't know if that's going to be able to happen in my lifetime or somebody else's lifetime, essentially. That might be the next generation that figures that out or has the technology to do it. But if we can figure an antimatter reactor out, then obviously we have the power to basically do a lot of applications. I don't know if negating gravity would be in those applications, but we certainly have enough power for things like, I don't know, obviously we'd be able to power homes and stuff like that with it. But would interplanetary travel be possible with it? I'm willing to go there. I hope you guys enjoyed me rambling. It's the holidays, so what are you going to give me for that? But I kind of wanted to make this a little bit of a special video for you guys. It's kind of like an end of the year treat. Whereas I basically say what got right and what could be happening. Until next time, guys, my name is Maniac with GameAccess.net. Take care. Over and out.